welcome to the Inside Out Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Knoll. Today is part 2 of Nutrition Fundamentals, where last week we discussed our macronutrients, our protein, carbs, and fat. They're calorie-containing substances that are required for our body to survive. And this week we're going to talk about our micronutrients, so our vitamins and our minerals. Also absolutely required substances to be able to survive and have our body function as they should be. They don't contain calories, but are incredibly important. So we'll dive into vitamins first. The format for today is basically going to be just listing out key vitamins. We're not going to go through all of them, but the functions and then some sources. If there is a deficiency or toxicity that's specifically relevant or interesting, I'll bring it up. But I do want to keep today brief and to just give you some takeaways to be able to assess your own diet or possible really wins that you're having or some negatives that we need to focus on. So we'll start with vitamins. Those are going to be our organic or carbon containing. Those will have two subcategories. It will be our water soluble and then our fat soluble. Our water soluble will include all of our B vitamins and our C. These are going to be nutrients that we have to focus on getting on a more regular basis because we only store a little bit in the liver. But the positive is they absorb without fat. They start absorption as soon as it enters the body and starts dissolving upon contact with water. It's more prevalent in foods. We don't have to worry about focusing on specific foods because there's a larger variety of foods that if we're getting a balanced diet, we're typically going to be just fine. And then the positive is even if you're eating a really processed diet, not that I want to push that, but the RDA's basically made sure you're going to be okay with that by requiring back in the 90s that we start fortifying our foods because we were seeing so many deficiencies in foods that we should never have been deficient in. So if that is something, if you want to turn over your cereal box and you want to see fortified nutrients listed in the ingredients, as well as some of our B vitamins listed out underneath the nutrition label, could be an interesting thing to look at because absolutely white bread does not naturally have B vitamins because we removed the whole grain germ from that. So that is something that has been removed but then added back in to make sure America stays okay because we do have a fairly processed diet. So with no further ado, let's jump into vitamins. Our water-soluble B vitamins. So thiamine, or B1, is going to be our first one. Like all of the B vitamins, it works with converting food into energy, supports nerve function. Common sources will be our whole grains, pork, legumes, nuts. So again, if you're having a variety of sources for your carbohydrates, you're going to be just fine for your thiamine. And a side note, I guess I'll jump back here, I apologize, but for deficiencies, it's a little bit more common if you're not having a varied diet, but toxicities for water soluble are very, very uncommon considering the fact that we do not store it. So to actually reach a toxic level, typically we'll have the result of diarrhea or just peeing it out. If you have a gene defect or you're not absorbing things like a normal individual, or you have a more unique case, then talking to a healthcare provider about possible nutrient interactions that could downregulate the absorption of specific would be worth looking into. Okay, and then B2 is going to be our riboflavin. So that's going to be, again, energy production, growth, and red blood cell formation. So super important. Works with the kidneys with that. So sources will be dairy, lean meats, leafy greens. So you got those lean meats and the leafy greens. If you're getting a protein source or a non-starchy carbohydrate, you're typically going to be pretty good on that. And you're also going to have very high contents in dairy products. Deficiencies that would be common to see would be skin disorders. So that could be itchy skin, that could be patchy skin, coloration skin issues. So if you do start noticing some issues with skin, riboflavin is a good one to look at. Sore throat would be another side effect, and then anemia. So it would decrease absorption of iron, which would and the red blood cell formation of our heme iron, which then results in a higher likelihood of anemia. B3 is going to be niacin. Function, again, converting food into energy, the metabolism and breakdown of our protein, carbs, and fat, and then it also works with skin and nerve health. So if our niacin is low, nerve sensitivity could be there. So looking at meat, fish, legumes, whole grains, truly any normal diet that's even 60% balanced with whole foods will be totally fine. A common deficiency would be nerve issues, digestive issues, some skin issues. So we'll typically see a B complex for riboflavin and niacin deficiencies. Turkey is going to be a really high source of niacin, and if you've ever heard tryptophan with turkey, these two typically will go hand in hand, but that's a side note. For B5, that's going to be our planktonic acid. This is going to be, again, specifically more of the metabolism of amino acids, so energy from protein, and then it also helps with the synthesis of hormones. Our sources will be meats, whole grains, vegetables. I think we're kind of seeing the theme here. If we're getting some meat, some whole grains, and some dark leafy greens, we're going to be at a good spot here. Very rare deficiencies in this, but possibly you could be looking at fatigue from, again, not having the same energy metabolism. B6 is going to be brain support, red blood cell formation. I really like to push this one if there is some mental health issues, looking at anxiety or depression. This is a common one to be deficient in. Sources are going to be meats, fish, nuts, and bananas. More likely in some cases is not that you're not consuming meat products or you're not getting, you're never having a banana, but that you actually are not absorbing to the fullest extent. So you essentially would need a lot more of B6. So supplementing with this, or just really focusing on those nutrients from the foods. And then a deficiency would be nerve damage, depression, and anemia. So very similar to our riboflavin, we're going to see a decreased red blood cell formation leading to anemia as a side effect. Our B7, or biotin, as is more commonly known, is a really popular one, but actually really important. It is a little bit less prevalent compared to our other B vitamins. It's going to be in egg yolks, nuts, and then the whole grain, but it's in smaller quantities. So really focusing on a good source of fat being from the egg yolks to get our biotin. It's going to be really important for carbohydrate and fat digestion, as well as protein, but will also work with nail and skin health. So this is like hair growing. If you've ever seen like a biotin supplement, Women's Health puts a big one on there. Some of the deficiencies could be hair loss or skin imperfections or issues. So one thing to look at. And then we're going to look at B9, which would be folic acid or folate, same thing. This is one that you'll see in addition to a lot of prenatal supplements for the reason that the most common deficiency would be neural tube defect for an infant within pregnancy. So if you are pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, taking a folic acid long before even starting that process would be really important to build and maintain those stores. We're going to see DNA synthesis, cell growth, and then obviously the health of our fetus is going to be the main functions of folic acid. Sources are going to be leafy greens, legumes, and fortified foods. So if you're not someone who has a whole lot of beans in their diet or isn't doing a bunch of dark leafy greens, I would double check your fortified foods, make sure you're getting enough. Because it's not as prevalent in the daily foods that we consume, it is definitely higher in the fortified list if you do look at nutrition labels. And then B12, super common deficiency despite it being a very prevalent in our sources. It's going to be in almost every animal product, dairy and meat. It will be in our vegetables. It will be in our fortified foods. However, we do need quite a bit of this. This is going to be it's in red blood cell formation, nerve function, and then the metabolism of energy. So if you notice some weakness, nerve damage, and then again anemia would be some of those deficiency possible side effects to look at. So if you've ever done a B12 IV drip, they typically are pretty well known for giving you a bunch of energy. That is kind of one of those new age things that actually is really beneficial if you're not getting a super diverse diet or you're simply not absorbing the B12 like you should. All right. And then we're going to get to our fat soluble. Fat soluble have the really cool effect that they are actually stored in the liver. And they can be stored for days, weeks, and even months. So we don't have to stress these at the same level of like a daily intake, but because they're not as prevalent, or the amount of in the foods that we consume isn't as prevalent, we do need to be consistent with a varied diet to keep those stores high. While it's really hard to get toxicity from our water-soluble vitamins, it's pretty doable from our fat-soluble from a supplemental perspective. If we're getting it from food, very, very low risk of actually developing a toxicity from overdoing food. It would be incredibly rare. Actually, I need to go back and talk vitamin C because we skipped that one in our water soluble. But vitamin C's main function is going to be immune function, really supporting our antioxidants, so basically cancer fighting cells, and then our collagen synthesis. So really important for overall maintaining just a good immune system. Deficiencies are almost completely never seen. It's scurvy. If you've ever heard the story of the ship coming over to America and all the sailors getting scurvy because they were just surviving off of fish and meat, not even getting potatoes or oranges, and then the oranges basically fixed it. So we did not really have any issues with this until the 80s, 90s, and then we started adding those fortified foods because of seeing deficiencies come up and things we should never have been deficient in. Basically, fruits, colorful foods, citrus fruits, all are going to be really, really high in vitamin C, but you get enough vitamin C from a potato to be able to have your daily needs met. So I would not stress vitamin C so much. If you are sick, it doesn't hurt to be able to add a little bit supplemented every 2 hours. Be like a 200 milligram dosage, which is a lot and it is frequent, but because it is water soluble, you do need to maintain frequently taking it if you're really trying to see the boosted effects of it. And that's a whole nother conversation. All right, so apologies, but we'll digress and get back to our fat-soluble vitamins. So again, we know that they're stored in the liver. They can store for longer periods of time. It requires fat to absorb. So if you are not consuming fat, so for example, you're just taking all of these supplements first thing in the morning, but you're not actually having a fat source, or say you're not eating with breakfast, the absorption rate will actually go down. Same thing is if you're just getting these from food, but you're having a very, very low-fat diet, you're going to struggle with being able to absorb and utilize and store these into the liver. So making sure fat supply in your whole day is met, as well as you're taking them with a fat source if you are taking a supplement. We'll start with vitamin A. Most people think vision health. We're going to have two different forms of it. You're going to have it from your vegetables and fruit, and then you'll have the actual like meat-based form of it. So vision, immune function, and then skin health. Common sources, I'm sure you've already heard of carrots, sweet potatoes, those really strong orange, but you'll also have spinach, kale, those darker leafy greens, and then liver is also a really good common source. Main reason being, the animals also store their fat-soluble vitamins in their liver, so you will see higher prevalence there. A side note, as we're going on to the side notes, liver is actually one of the only foods you can truly reach a nutrient toxicity on because of how much stored nutrients are there. Outside of that, you're pretty much free to eat as much, whole foods and not worry about reaching a nutrient toxicity. Deficiencies of vitamin A would be night blindness, impaired immunity, so struggle with immune health. So again, if sickness is going around, a vitamin A, C, and then D, which is the next one, would be a really good benefit. Vitamin D is going to be actually the number one deficiency in all of the U.S., which is crazy, specifically in Arizona. So if you are in Arizona, you have actually a higher likelihood of being vitamin D deficient. Part of it because no one wants to be out in the sun when it's 120 degrees. So if this is you and you know that you kind of avoid sunlight and you put a lot of sunscreen on, which wonderful, protect, and we don't want to deal with melanoma down the road, but be aware of the fact that we do need, our body already has vitamin D and we need to synthesize it naturally through the sun. So a few minutes outside without any blocking of the UV ray lights would be very beneficial. So sunlight is the best source you can get from vitamin D, and I would really encourage 10-15 minutes a day. Take, if it's wintertime, try to just at least wear a short sleeve shirt, something where your exposure, but best form would take your shirt off and have that chest exposure for the best absorption of vitamin D or synthesis of vitamin D naturally. You'll see it in fortified dairy products, but I always take this with a grain of salt, because if you are not checking the amounts, it's pretty small, so you'd have to consume a lot of dairy products to really get adequate vitamin D levels. Same thing, you'll see it in mushrooms, but you would have to have a UV ray synthesized mushroom, so you have to be very specific in what you're looking for. So very common to be supplemented for vitamin D. You also see it in fatty fish, so that's a really good source. But as you've heard on plenty of commercials, vitamin is going to be super important for calcium absorption. So if our vitamin D is high, it upregulates calcium absorption, which is something we do need to be aware of if we're also consuming too much vitamin D supplementation and we have a calcium surplus. So that's a side note, but be aware. Bone health, and then obviously immune function. We're going to have vitamin K, which is going to be blood clotting and bone health. Good sources being leafy greens, broccoli, liver. You're going to be aware if you're on a blood thinner that we do need to be a little bit more cognizant of naturally not having too many of the leafy greens, because it can adversely increase the clotting and thus decrease the actual benefit of like a medication like Coumadin, something that is going to thin the blood. So make sure you're talking to your doctor. It does not mean you cannot consume leafy greens. I dislike when they put that out there and just like, don't eat vegetables while you're on this medication. Just be aware of the sheer volume. And then obviously a deficiency would be the opposite of the function, which is impaired blood clotting and excessive bleeding. For vitamin E, we're going to look at it, the main function being antioxidant, so it works with vitamin C in immune and protection against cancerous cells or free radicals, and it protects the cell membranes. So functions being very important for longevity. And people like to put anti-aging in. You've probably seen a vitamin E serum for the face, but it does do a good job of protecting those cell membranes. For sources, we're looking at nuts, seeds, vegetable oils. So if you are getting enough unsaturated fat sources, you're going to be totally fine. Some common deficiencies would be pretty rare, but you could see nerve or muscle damage. Really high doses of supplementing vitamin E can lead to bleeding issues. So just being aware of not over supplementing vitamin E. All right, so for our minerals, these are going to be non-organic or not carbon-containing substances. Our minerals are going to have macro minerals, and they're going to have micro minerals or trace minerals. So essentially things that we need of greater amounts or smaller amounts. We'll just go through the top really 5, which will be our electrolytes as well as iron. And then I'll have that guide to be able to refer to later on for a little bit more detail. So our calcium is going to be our strong bones, teeth, muscle function, nerve transmission, those sources being from our leafy greens, our fortified foods, and our dairy products. You'll see lots of commercials for calcium for kids, but it's incredibly important for the development of those puberty on. Having a calcium-rich diet is going to be really, really important. Deficiencies, long-term, you could see osteoporosis or muscle cramping. And then overdoing calcium, like I mentioned before with the vitamin D. So if you are supplementing vitamin D and you have a calcium upregulation, so you have too much calcium, you do need to be aware that constipation could be a side effect, as well as kidney stones. So if you're dealing with kidney stones, take a look at calcium intake. And if calcium intake's totally fine, then make sure you're taking a look at your vitamin D. All right, and then we got magnesium. This is going to be electrolyte. It's going to work with muscle and nerve function, bone health, and energy production. Sources being from nuts, seeds, whole grains, leafy greens. Again, fortified foods, typically supplementation like a electrolyte supplement. Very common deficiencies that will happen pretty quickly, specifically when it's really hot in the summer and you're drinking tons of water and you're sweating a bunch and electrolytes are being depleted, is you're going to see muscle weakness, some cramps, and heart arrhythmias. So making sure that your magnesium, potassium, and sodium all balance out if you're drinking a bunch of water. So don't over and quickly drink water without actually having the electrolytes to offset that. And then potassium is going to be another electrolyte. It's going to be working with muscle contractions and nerve impulses. We're going to have sources being from bananas, oranges, avocados, vegetables, legumes. So again, if you're getting really eaten closer to the rainbow, you're going to be in a really good spot with potassium. You're not going to get any from meat products, so just making sure that if you are outside a lot, that not all of your sources of carbohydrates are coming from grains, that you are getting it from those starchy and simple sugar and complex sugar fruits and vegetables. Deficiencies, you'll see muscle weakness, cramps, and an irregular heartbeat. Potassium's will help with the regulation of muscle contractions, which obviously will then impact our heart and blood pressure. So if blood pressure is off, it could be a result of a electrolyte deficiency. And then sodium is going to be another one of those electrolytes, but works mainly in fluid balance. And our body obviously is made up of a lot of water, so fluid balance is super important. Sodium is typically kind of demonized as being this really negative thing, but we absolutely require sodium for our brain fluids, for internal and external fluids in our body, and for nerve functions. So sources, table salt, processed foods, pretty easy to make sure we get enough. However, if you are cooking predominantly 95% of your meals from home and you don't put a lot of salt on there, it could be something that you do need to be aware of if you're not eating very much processed foods, but you're sweating a lot. You may want to actually salt your water or add in an electrolyte supplement. And then the negative would be a toxicity of way too much sodium can lead to the high blood pressure, but that typically is from low potassium. So I want to put that out there, that it's not necessarily a direct result from sodium, it's the ratio between sodium and potassium. All right, so basically, in conclusion, the easiest way to make sure we have all of the vitamins and minerals we need to have a healthy, well-functioning body is essentially just eat variety. So if you're looking at a carb source in your day and you like to eat very similarly, just look for a grain source, a fruit source, a vegetable source. So you are getting a wide variety of starch and a non-starch. Same thing with protein. Get your poultries, get your fish, have red meat, have a balanced variety of different protein forms, and then obviously same thing with fats. Do some of your animal-based, do some dairy for your fat sources, but then also make sure you're using your unsaturated fats or your plant-based fat products such as nuts, getting a variety of types of nuts, seeds, and avocado to be able to balance out those needs. Same thing, egg yolks, that's a really good source of both minerals and vitamins. So all that to say, if you are getting a balanced diet, you're having the occasional fortified food in there, you're going to be in a good spot. If you are still having some of the symptoms of deficiencies, it could be an absorption issue, whether it's an enzyme, a cofactor, something else could be going on. So if that is a case, I would definitely seek out someone who's going to be more customized to you, talking to your doctor. Obviously, I'm happy to talk to you as well. So if you are interested in learning more, or you liked what you heard today and would like to learn more, you can go to my website, InsideOutNutritionUSA.com, or find me on Instagram at InsideOutNutritionUSA. All right, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for taking the time to listen.